Donald Trump has until Monday to solve a $450 million problem. But how exactly did it get here, and how could it play out? CNN senior legal analyst and former federal and state prosecutor Ellie Honig is right here with us. Well, what are we talking about? Where did this start? Where does this dollar figure come from?
Yeah, John, so let's go back to the beginning. This case is the civil lawsuit filed by the New York State Attorney General Letitia James against Donald Trump and his companies, alleging, and now having proved, that they overinflated their assets and then used that in order to get loans from banks. Now, the judge returned a verdict for Donald Trump. The verdict was in the amount of $355 million plus interest. You somehow did the math and backed it out, is what gets us to that 450.
Breaking news, 30 insurance companies, 30 separate risk assessments, 30 answers that all said the same thing: no. Donald Trump, the man who built his entire public identity on being a billionaire, who wrote The Art of the Deal, who spent 14 seasons on national television firing people as the ultimate symbol of financial success, could not find a single insurance company willing to back a $450 million bond on his behalf. Not one. And the reason those 30 companies all reached the same conclusion is the same reason a New York court ordered Trump to pay $354 million in the first place. The properties he claimed were worth hundreds of millions of dollars are not worth hundreds of millions of dollars. The financial statements he submitted to banks and insurance companies for over a decade were fabricated, and the fraud that inflated his paper wealth for 30 years is now the reason that same wealth cannot cover the bond he needs to stay out of enforcement. The scheme that worked for a decade collapsed at the exact moment it was most needed. Tonight, we break down exactly how we got here, what the $450 million number actually means, and what it says about a financial empire that a court found was built in significant part on fiction. I'm Hannah Blake. This is Global News Diary. Let's get into it. To understand the bond crisis, you have to understand the case that produced it, because the two are inseparable in ways that make the current situation almost poetic in its irony. In September 2022, New York State Attorney General Letitia James filed a civil lawsuit against Donald Trump, his sons, and the Trump Organization. The allegation was straightforward. For over a decade, from roughly 2011 to 2021, Trump had been submitting financial statements to banks and insurance companies that claimed his properties were worth dramatically more than they actually were. He used those inflated valuations to get better loan terms from banks, lower premiums from insurance companies, and more favorable terms in business arrangements. In plain language, he was lying to banks to get better deals. And under New York law, that is fraud. Trump's lawyers spent the entire trial hammering one argument: the banks got their money back. Nobody lost money. There are no victims. Where is the harm? It sounds reasonable on the surface, but it misses a fundamental legal point. The law does not require a victim who lost money to prove fraud. If you lie to get a better deal, that is fraud, even if the other side never lost a dime. What the law comes after is the benefit you obtain through the lie. That benefit, calculated across a decade of fraudulent financial statements, the difference in loan terms, the difference in insurance premiums, compounded across multiple properties and multiple transactions, added up to $354 million. That is the disgorgement order. Give back what you gained through fraud. Add the 9% annual interest that runs automatically on New York civil judgments from the day they are entered, and by the time the deadline arrived, the total had climbed north of $450 million, growing by approximately $87,000 every single day. The scale of the overvaluation that the court documented is not a matter of aggressive but defensible financial estimates. It is not a rounding error. The gap between what Trump claimed his properties were worth and what they were actually worth is staggering in ways that make the fraud finding almost self-evident once the numbers are laid out side by side. Mar-a-Lago, Trump's Florida estate, his primary residence, the property that became one of the most famous addresses in American politics, was valued on Trump's financial statements at $426 million. Independent appraisers brought in during the trial assessed its actual market value at between $18 million and $27 million. Trump was claiming a property was worth 16 times its actual value, not twice, not 3 times, 16 times. And he was using that claim year after year to negotiate better loan rates from banks and lower premiums from insurance companies. The Seven Springs estate in Westchester County, 212 acres that Trump claimed were worth hundreds of millions, was similarly overvalued by independent appraisers. Attorney General James, anticipating the need for enforcement, had already registered the judgment in Westchester County specifically because of that property. The pattern across the entire portfolio was consistent. Properties valued on financial statements at numbers that bore no relationship to what independent market analysis showed they were actually worth. The overvaluations ranged from 7 to 22 times actual market value across different properties and different transactions. Trump spent years telling the world he was worth billions. The court found after a full trial with documents, expert witnesses, and testimony from his own executives that the specific numbers on his financial statements were fabricated, not aggressive, not optimistic. Fabricated. Understanding why the bond became a crisis requires understanding what a bond actually is and why the legal system requires one when a defendant wants to appeal a civil judgment. When you lose a civil case and want to appeal, the law does not allow you to simply file the appeal and disappear while the winning party waits indefinitely to collect what they are owed. Letitia James won. She was legally entitled to begin collecting the $450 million immediately. The bond is the mechanism that stops her from collecting while Trump appeals, a guarantee that if he loses the appeal, the money will still be there. Here is how it works in practice. A bonding company, typically an insurance company or a bank, certifies to the court that if Trump does not pay after losing his appeal, they will cover it. They stand behind the guarantee. In exchange for providing that guarantee, the bonding company requires Trump to post collateral, cash, real estate, assets that the bonding company can liquidate if the guarantee is called. Trump had been claiming publicly in posts on Truth Social that he had $500 million in cash. If that were true, the bond would have been straightforward. You put up the cash, an insurance company writes the bond within 48 hours. The deadline disappears. But 30 companies looked at Trump's assets, including that claimed $500 million in cash, and walked away. Every single one of them. That outcome tells you something specific about what those companies found when they looked at the documentation. Bonding companies are not making political statements. Their entire business is accurately assessing financial risk. When they walk away, they are saying the math does not work. When 30 of them walk away, they are saying it unanimously and independently. Either Trump had $500 million in cash, in which case posting the bond would have been straightforward, or he did not. Those two things cannot both be true simultaneously. Here is the detail that makes the bond crisis more than just a legal story. It is the detail that transforms it into something almost Shakespearean in its structure. The properties Trump inflated for a decade to extract financial advantages, the same properties he used to claim extraordinary wealth, to get better loan rates, to negotiate lower insurance premiums. Those are now the assets he needs to post as collateral to cover the bond. And the bonding companies, armed with the court's findings, are doing what the banks never did. They are looking at the actual numbers, not the stated numbers on Trump's financial statements, the actual market values. Mar-a-Lago, at its actual value of $18 to $27 million, is not collateral for a $450 million obligation. Seven Springs, at its actual appraised value, does not close the gap. Trump Tower, valued accurately, helps, but not enough. The entire portfolio, valued honestly rather than at the fictional numbers Trump had been claiming for a decade, does not get him where he needs to be. The fraud inflated his paper net worth by hundreds of millions of dollars. But it cannot inflate the collateral the bonding companies will accept. The gap between the fictional net worth he claimed and the actual net worth the market is pricing, that gap is exactly the size of the crisis he is in. The scheme worked for 30 years because nobody looked too hard. Banks lent him money at better rates because his financial statements said he was worth more. Insurance companies wrote policies at lower premiums because his stated property values justified it. Deutsche Bank, his primary lender for nearly 20 years, the only major Western bank still willing to do business with him after his Atlantic City casino bankruptcies, kept extending credit because Trump kept showing them financial statements claiming his properties were worth enormous amounts. Then Letitia James looked hard. The court looked hard, and 30 insurance companies looked hard. They all found the same thing. The scheme that worked for a decade collapsed at the exact moment it was most needed, when Trump needed those inflated assets to function as real collateral for a real financial obligation. The fraud is the reason the assets are worthless as bond collateral. The same lie that generated the judgment is the reason he cannot cover the judgment. That is not coincidence. That is the logical consequence of a financial architecture built on fiction finally being tested against reality. The Deutsche Bank dimension of this story deserves attention because it explains how the fraud operated at scale and for so long without being detected by the institutions that should have caught it. Deutsche Bank was Trump's primary lender for almost 20 years, the only major Western bank still willing to do business with him after his 1990s Atlantic City casino bankruptcies wiped out his relationships with American financial institutions. Most major banks had written him off entirely. Deutsche kept lending. Why? Because Trump kept presenting financial statements claiming his properties were worth enormous amounts, and Deutsche Bank, for reasons that its own internal risk assessments should have questioned, kept accepting those statements and extending credit. The civil fraud case is, in part, the legal documentation of what Deutsche had been tolerating for 2 decades. The same inflated numbers, the same gap between stated value and actual market value, the same fiction dressed up in formal financial statement language and submitted to a major financial institution as fact. When Deutsche cut ties with Trump in January 2021, immediately after January 6th, his access to major institutional lending essentially disappeared. Not coincidentally, that is the same period during which the Attorney General's investigation was deepening and the documentation of the fraud was being assembled. The bonding companies facing the $450 million problem are doing in real time and with the benefit of a court's findings what Deutsche Bank should have done years earlier, looking at the actual numbers, running the actual math, and reaching the actual conclusion that the documentation supports. The difference is that Deutsche Bank had 20 years of relationship history and a willingness to look away. The bonding companies have Engoron's ruling and a legal obligation to accurate risk assessment. The outcome is 30 no's instead of 20 years of yeses. The resolution of the bond crisis and the broader trajectory of the case reveals something important about how the legal system and Trump's political operation function in parallel, on separate tracks with entirely different logics. On the legal track, the appellate division reduced the bond requirement. Trump posted a $175 million bond through a California insurance billionaire. The immediate enforcement crisis was deferred. The appellate division, 5 judges, later vacated the $354 million penalty on Eighth Amendment excessive fines grounds. But here is what those 5 judges did not do. They did not say the fraud did not happen. Every single one of them, including the judge who wanted to throw out the entire case, acknowledged that the trial record showed fraudulent conduct. The fraud finding sits on the legal record. The debate is only about how much it costs. On the political track, every element of the legal crisis was converted into content. Persecution narrative, fundraising urgency, Truth Social posts at 6 a.m. calling the bond unconstitutional and the judge corrupt. His campaign sent fundraising texts implying donations would help with the bond, which campaign finance rules do not permit, before quickly clarifying that the fundraising was general. The base believed the case was a witch hunt. The money flowed in. Trump lost on the legal track for 2 years. He won the presidency on the political track. Both of those things are true simultaneously. And that is what makes the entire story clarifying. The legal mechanism does not care about Truth Social posts. The bond deadline does not pause because a candidate is leading in the polls. The enforcement apparatus does not wait for an election. The market, 30 insurance companies making independent risk assessments, does not care about the persecution narrative. The fraud that inflated his assets for a decade is the same reason those assets could not cover his bond. The scheme worked until the moment it was most needed. And when it was most needed, 30 separate risk assessments all reached the same answer. Here is today's question, and it is one that goes beyond politics to something more fundamental. 30 insurance companies independently assessed Donald Trump's claimed $500 million in assets and said the math does not work. The court found the same thing after a full trial, but Trump won the presidency 8 months after the fraud finding. What does that tell us about the relationship between legal accountability and political outcomes in America today? Drop your answer in the comments. This community brings some of the most thoughtful analysis anywhere on this platform. The best responses get featured in our next video. If this breakdown gave you the full picture on one of the most consequential legal stories in recent American history, hit that like button right now. 2 seconds, that is all it takes. Subscribe if you are not already here. We cover the stories that matter, political, legal, military, with the depth and context they deserve. Turn on notifications. Stories like this one develop fast, and the next chapter is always closer than you think. Share this video, send it to someone who has been following this case and wants the complete picture. This is the breakdown they need. I'm Hannah Blake. This is Global News Diary. We will be back with the next major story the moment it breaks. Stay sharp, stay informed.